Hello. Welcome to this case study with Naseem Jamnia. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. I'm going to read your bio so everybody knows how impressive you are. But before I get into that, I have to read just the first, I guess I would call it a blurb, but it's about you, not necessarily one of your books on your website, which I love that you started as like the biggest, it's like a picture of them. And then this quote, which is Naseem Jamia is fierce and dangerous in all the best ways. And that's a quote from David Anthony Durham, who is the author of the Acacia trilogy. How
Yeah.
badass is that?
It was a
I
very
love.
nice blurb. Yeah, I asked him to blurb my debut and he came back with this and I was like, "Oh my God, David." Like,
Yeah.
thank you so
Thank you for
much. Like,
seeing me. I love that. Okay, so I'm going to read your bio really quick, and then we're going to get into questions, which I have a whole bunch of. Markowitz Award winning and Astounding Award winning nominated author Naseem Jamnia, they, them, writes speculative fiction for adults, teens, and kids. Their adult fantasy novella, The Bruising of Kilwa, was nominated for the Crawford, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards. And they contributed to the YA horror anthology, The White Guy Dies First 13 Scary Stories of Fear and Power. I love that title.
I know.
Not that we want you to die, guys, but you know. A Persian Chicagoan, former neuroscientist, and current educator and pro library activist, Naseem currently lives outside Reno, Nevada with their husband and four furred creatures. And their newest book, The Glade, just came out in May, and it's their middle grade debut.
Yes, that's me.
Okay. So the first question I have for you, because as we talked even before this, was we've had a kind of a long relationship together. You took
Yeah,
my
we have.
first ever online author branding course like almost 10 years ago now. I was trying to
Wow.
look up the date and I was like, oh.
Oh my
So we've known
God,
each
has
other
it
for a
really been?
while. Yeah, I think it was like
Holy crap.
2017. So we got like and then we worked together for a bit on your brand prior to the launch of the Bruising of Kiowa. And now you have the Glade and middle grade. That's a big shift.
Middle grade's a big shift. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what drew you to write for middle grade, for starters.
Yeah, this is a great question because it surprises people that I jumped from adult to middle grade. There is obviously more differences between a middle grade and an adult than just the marketing. But when I queried my agent, I had written a middle grade myth retelling story. So originally, I thought that I would be debuting in the middle grade space. And then, like we didn't sell that manuscript, and I was working on other manuscripts, and I started working on Kill while I was doing my MFA. And that was kind of naturally adult, and we managed to sell it. And I was very excited, especially because it's a novella, and novellas in the speculative fiction space have been appreciating a resurgence. But Kidlit was always there for me. Even while I was working on my adult projects, I have a lot kind of in the crossover space between YA and adult, and I've written some from some young adult, and then it kind of came back to middle grade. And so when this project fell across my lap, because I was actually hired to write The Glade, I was really excited to jump into it because I love writing for this age range. I think it's such a key point for literacy, and I think it's a great place to get kids excited to read, which is something we really always need, but really need right now.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I wanted to ask you if it's all right if I link to your bookseller sheet for this book as an
Yes,
example
please
for
do.
people to take a look at. And I think it's
Good.
really helpful because it can be informative for other authors, especially new authors who haven't done this before, understanding the different selling points and how to talk about the story, how to sell the story in the book description,
Yeah,
But it got me thinking about this age group specifically, what's happening developmentally and especially socially, where things like everything is painful at that age in terms of
everything painful.
identity. You're growing and it's just like, what is happening in my life? And to have a book that is really about story, but also very representative of queer and brown characters, it seems like a very key place to have that type of literature that's super important to affirm their own life experience.
Yeah, I absolutely believe so. I think representation is important across all ages, but I think we need certain kinds of representation for kids, particularly in this day and age. But I also think about like the kid I was in the 90s, not having language to describe my gender, not ever seeing my culture reflected in books. I mean, we've come such a long way, even though we haven't come far enough. I'm grateful without also kind of kidding myself that certain groups have probably like no representation in this space, right? There's very few Iranian authors, let alone like Kurdish authors, let alone like Tajik authors, like any just within West Asia, let alone the rest of Asia or the world. And middle grade in particular, yeah, I mean it's this interesting space because when you're in middle grade, you're almost there. You're like, oh wait a minute, I am a person in this world and in this community, but you haven't gotten yet, I think, to the angst, unless you have childhood anxiety and depression, which I did. That, so the angst kind of always comes with you, right? But I don't think any kid doesn't go through questions of identity, right? Even if it's not, it doesn't have to necessarily be like a marginalized identity, but even just the matter of like, I am in this rural community. Do I belong in this rural community? Do I feel at home here? Or like, oh yeah, I feel at home, but my friend doesn't, right? I think the middle school years are ripe for that. And my understanding is that COVID has set back a lot of kids socially, so I think it's all the more important that the kids who didn't have quote unquote normal socialization, whatever you want to describe to normality, quote unquote, it's all the more important that we think about what they're reading at that age and hoping that they'll read, encourage them to read, like, I think the fact that literacy in this country is, I'm like going way off track, but I don't think it's unrelated, like literacy in the United States is abysmal and a lot of kids don't know how to read. And that's horrifying and tragic. And I think kids are going to be more willing to read stuff where they're seeing themselves represented in some way or people that they care about. And that's my spiel on why representation is important.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so speaking of representation, and good storytelling, I feel like that's such a hard thing to navigate. And maybe that's just a misperception that I have as a reader, but I'm always impressed when people can just seamlessly integrate different types of representation in the storyline where it's not like beating you over the head like this book is about, How do you do that?
So part of this is a tricky question because part of it is a question of lived experience. Like in my daily life, I am constantly talking about things like race and gender and sexuality. I mean, that's not an exaggeration to say I'm doing it in my daily life. And I think that is something that a lot of marginalized people feel, whether they're queer, whether they're racialized, whether they're both or disabled or what have you. Part of it is we are often in communities of other people who share those experiences. And so if something happens, for ill or for worse or for neutral, we bring those up. Part of it is interacting with any sort of outside world or society makes you aware of those things. Even if nothing quote unquote happens, you are very, very aware. I live in northern Nevada, which, has a high like white population. But just by the nature of like going to the grocery store, I'm very aware of being a racialized individual, even though because I have light skin, that gives me a lot of passing privilege in that sense. And I think that part of it for storytelling is thinking about, what is the environment that your characters are coming across? If it's something like a secondary world, a world that you've made up, which is the case in my debut, you have a choice to decide what kind of assumptions and quote unquote normal is of your society. So, in The Bruising of Kilwa, I made a very distinct choice to make it both queer normative and trans normative, where people introduce themselves with their pronouns, where transness is kind of, not blinked at. The baseline assumption is queerness such that it's no longer queer, right? That's not a term that they would use in that story. And that doesn't mean that they don't have struggles. There's a translation-related plot line in Kilwa that has to do with the fact that the characters are migrants. And it's about migrant access to healthcare as opposed to the issue of being trans. But when you're writing set in our world, you have to consider, where are these characters and what are they coming up against? And if they're kids, it's not that kids aren't aware of these things. They absolutely are. Kids clock things immediately. They might not have the same language, though, to describe it or to even realize that they've clocked it, right? I just think about like moments where my main character in the Glade, Pina, would overhear things that her best friend's guardians, who are abusive to her best friend, would say. And she doesn't understand that it's abusive. Like she doesn't clock quite like, oh, this is emotional abuse that they are doing to my best friend. But she does say a thing like, well, that was a weird and mean thing to say. A part of it is that Pina and her best friend Joe are both half white and half racialized. Pina is half Iranian. Her best friend Joe is half Filipino. And Joe is raised by their white family. They don't have contact to their Filipino family. And they're raised essentially by people who have assumptions about what it means to be white and what it means to be brown. And they say kind of really racially coded things like calling Joe a mutt, which is a very, that's what's a slur when you're not actually using like a slur word, right? That's akin to a slur. And Pina's like, I heard them say that, and that was weird because Joe's not a dog. That's how Pina understands, like, this is weird and uncomfortable and I don't like it and there's something else here. So for kids, it's, you don't want to deny the fact that they live in the world that they live in. When but at the same token, you live in the world that you live in. I really think writers have kind of moral imperatives to think about the things that they're doing in their work, and particularly if you're writing for children. And the reality is that children face people like and unlike them all the time. Even if they're from like small rural communities where a lot of people look like that. Even in that case, they still do. Like queerness is everywhere, but there's also families of color who find themselves in really small kind of rural pockets, right? And a lot of it is remembering that you're writing like a child protagonist and like kind of what are they gonna clock, and treating that with a sense of dignity, I think is a really big key. Like, don't talk down to kids. And also recognize that they don't have the same kind of language to describe stuff. So I really tried to play that balance in the Glade, thinking about the fact that Pina is half white, half Iranian. The friends that she encounters at camp are also racialized. The queerness stuff is pretty low key because Pina is aromantic, and so it's kind of like, I don't understand crushes. I guess this is flirting. What as like a 12-year-old kind of understands, right? Like. And also all the things that she has internalized by being this, multiracial kid in the Midwest, and the things that she sees that she doesn't necessarily have words for, but can still acknowledge feels a certain way. And that's something that my editor and I worked really hard on as we were thinking about the fact that these kids all have racialized experiences, these kids all have queer experiences, and so how are they coming to the page with those in a way that feels authentic to kids and not as an adult writing a child? That, I think, is particularly where the balance has to be struck. Remembering that you were an adult and not 10, 11, 12 years old. But also, how did it feel to be 10, 11, and 12 years old?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And as you're talking about that, we've been so used to the history of the majority of literature being very Western and white. But if you put it in the context of what you're talking about, it's like, it's just good character development, period.
Yeah.
Bringing a character's entire life, all those factors, it's literally who they are.
Right.
It's not some weird manufactured thing. I
think there's this kind of thought that like, oh, we're adding, like we're quote unquote adding diversity where it doesn't need to be or something. It's like, but like people aren't diverse. Like that's not how we talk about people. We talk about people. We talked about their lived experiences, and people's lived experiences are diverse, even within the same small community. That is the case, right? And I think disability is actually probably a really good place to see this because every single person knows somebody who is disabled in some form, right? Whether it's they're disabled because they're elderly and so they've developed disability over their lifetime, whether it's that they're neurodivergent, whether it's, something happened and they become disabled, right? Disability is a factor of life that everyone at some point will experience by the nature of getting old, if nothing else. But I definitely don't want to say like disability is normalized, but a lot of times like within families, they're normalized. So if nothing else, I think a lot of people can appreciate like, oh yeah, I do know that like one person who has some sort of lived experience of some kind, right? And so that's the case for disability, and that's the case for other all sorts of other different identity markers too. You know, I think race
Yeah.
is one that's particularly salient. And I think queerness is one that's particularly salient, potentially because of the time that we live in. That these are, not that these identities haven't always been politicized, they have, but they're particularly charged right now.
Yeah, so let's jump to that question because I have that question as well, which is what is it like to be writing, as you state on your website, very queer and very brown characters, dealing with so many of the issues that the majority of people in power right now are trying to take away rights and take away respect and ban the books.
Yeah. It's, one of the things is like, I can't not write this way because it rings hollow for me otherwise. So part of it is that, and part of it is I think that just, I feel the moral push to do so. I think about being the child who volunteered at the library and was reading dozens and dozens of books each month, who was very lonely, who felt isolated by the fact of having an immigrant family, a really disabled brother, living in a house that was bilingual and in a major city, right? I grew up in Chicago, not a suburb. And I felt so isolated, and books were the one thing that were my lifeline. And I really think about what that kid needed. And even though we're in a different publishing space in many respects, again, like the fact that I can list off Iranian authors now is huge. And yet also there's always room for more of us, right? And I feel like as somebody who is publicly out as queer and trans, as somebody who talks a lot about the fact that my family is from Iran and imports kind of those cultural stuff into my stories, I don't think I have a choice but to write the stories that I feel are truest to my heart, if not my lived experiences, the things that I want to see in the world. And I think every writer, right, has these stories that they're like, I have to tell these stories. And the truest way to tell those stories is to tell them how they're meant to be told. So, yeah it's tough because, on one level, it's good because I'm like a nobody author. So like nobody's going to come knocking at my door being like, why are you sexualizing children? On the other hand, I do a lot of pro-library activism. I am the Nevada chapter lead for Authors Against Book Bans. I helped start Freedom to Read Nevada here in Northern Nevada. And I'm constantly thinking about library stuff. And like I said, like I'm a little mid-list author that no one has heard of, but I have friends whose books have been challenged and have faced that and the kind of devastation that wrought, because there's this misconception that like banned books leads to sales. It's like, that's not actually the case, right? Like, except for like stuff like To Kill a Mockingbird, that's not actually the case. It actually leads to a chilling effect where like schools and libraries sometimes preemptively will pull books off the shelves in fear that they're going to be challenged. And we know that this is particularly true of like the marginalized authors who are being attacked, that their books are now, that is going to be held against them for their publishing careers. It is a scary time, but artists have done nothing if not challenged culturally. It's a slow kind of cultural shift, but if we don't keep writing the stuff we're going to do, we're just going to capitulate faster into fascism.
I totally agree. It's a weird place where there's so many artists who have said how important it is to create during times like these, really directly going against the tide. And that's a hard thing to do. I love what you're saying, and I think I very much agree that you need to do the things you feel like you're pulled or called to do in the world, and that there's a place for that, and it's an important piece of the patchwork or the puzzle. But how do you take care of yourself on a personal level in that? Because you got to take breaks from it too and take care of yourself, right?
Yeah, that's a tough question, because I definitely have had kind of near breakdowns being like, I wish I wasn't drawn to this work. Like if I'm being completely honest, it's hard. I really wish I could sit back and not, and even just choose one facet of my identity to write about, right? It's so much easier if I could just write Iranian characters. I could just write queer characters. Or, that now I'm realizing how many of my characters have been neurodivergent that I didn't realize were neurodivergent just by the nature of course, internalized ableism, but also being late diagnosed with ADHD and OCD. Just being like, oh, all of those characters I wrote like Pina in the Glade is coded autistic, which I didn't realize until an autistic friend read it and was like, "This Pina's definitely autistic." Like, I'm like, oh, yeah, she absolutely is. And she didn't start off that way. Like, as she became truer versions of herself, she became autistic. So anyway, all that to say, like, yeah, it is emotionally exhausting to feel like you are fighting this Sisyphean battle of even just trying to get your work noticed, let alone kind of all the other things that are trapped around that. But even just like whether you're at the querying stage, I mean, I was querying for 4 or 5 years before I signed with my agent. I wrote a couple of new projects in between, but the one that I queried that I think I discussed at the beginning of this was not, when I started my querying journey, it was not the same project by any stretch. Very, very different. And now, just kind of like trying to sell my work now, despite the fact that I'm very lucky and I have sold 2 books and my work has been anthologized in a few anthologies. And the thing that I'm constantly, one of the things I'm trying to challenge myself to do now is figure out where I begin or where I end and the work begins and give myself some grace there. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to fall into the "I'm not doing enough" trap, which I constantly fall into. I wrote a newsletter about it a few weeks ago where I was just like, I never feel like I'm doing enough. And the reality is that someone else is always doing more because that's life, right? In the same kind of way we can be like, someone else always has it worse than you do. Someone else is always doing more. And that is humanity. That is kind of what it means to be human, is that we're all different and drawn to our different things and have to, and go at our own different paces. And so what I'm trying to do now is figure out how I can have enough nourishment to be able to do the work, because burnout doesn't help anybody. This is the thing I have to keep telling myself. So I'm like saying this aspirationally, that like taking a break is not selfish. Trying to prevent yourself from hitting burnout is not selfish, and it can feel that way. So part of it is acknowledging the fact that it doesn't feel like enough, and it does feel like taking a break is a luxury. But I think a lot about the metaphor of the giving tree not saving an apple for itself at the end to grow back. You have to have that kind of honest conversation with yourself, because it's a lot easier to not do the work. But at the same token, it's also a lot easier to not attend to yourself while you're doing the work. That's the thing that I'm trying really hard to now internalize, is like, I have to take care of myself if I'm going to do the work. So I try to do what I can. Like, I'm trying to dissociate with audiobooks less than I did. But sometimes I like give myself the grace to dissociate with audiobooks. I have a lot of pets, and so, like when I go on my walks with the dogs, I try to be present in those walks. So I think a lot of it is just the perpetual balancing act and being honest with yourself, which is very hard. I am not always honest with myself. Again, a lot of this is aspirational. I'm working on it.
For sure. Well, I mean, that's a big part of author branding, is being really honest with yourself and what you want and what your limitations are and what your passions are and all those things too. It's why it's so intrinsically linked to just your entire identity as a human being, but also how you work in the world. And well, for instance, in my own life, I have had more drive to like restore myself in the past year than ever before because of everything that's going on. So I am only going on Instagram, for instance, like once a week, because I know for myself, it's a mental health problem.
Yeah.
Like, if I have access every day, that's when I notice like that's where the imposter syndrome comes in more, or the feeling of I'm not doing enough. And I think we have to keep remembering that this feeling of not doing enough is something that we have been indoctrinated with.
Absolutely.
It's not that there isn't a human component to maybe the competitiveness of it or whatever, but I don't think that we are naturally born thinking we're not doing enough. I think that we are socialized to think that because of the way our society is. And I think we really, as creators, have to find that time and the kinds of activities like you're talking about that restore us.
Yeah.
Or we just burn ourselves out.
I read this book recently called Empire of Normality, which argues that the development of capitalism and the development of how we think about neurodivergence are directly linked. And of course, it's kind of like at a beginning, diversity studies in academia are at a very nascent stage. It certainly acknowledges that it's a limited analysis, but it's a very compelling one, this idea of the rise of capitalism, particularly this globalized neoliberal late stage capitalism, has changed, as I just heard my spouse laugh. We've been talking a lot about this lately, has changed the way that we approach labor and we approach health. And, this just thinking about one of the arguments that the author makes is that, like, now that we have smartphones, we are constantly bombarded by capitalism in the sense of like advertisements. Like you go on social media and you're getting a gazillion ads. Like my phone just went off and it's like, oh, it's asking for my attention in that way. And that attention is likely so that it eventually leads to some sort of spending of money, some sort of exchange. I think about the fact that like many of us get, we'll get our emails at like 10 p.m. and we'll be like, oh, let me answer my email. We don't have these clear kind of boundaries around work and home anymore. Those have really, really been eroded. The fact that we're constantly, like your boss could call you up at any moment sort of thing, right? I think a lot of people have experienced that. The boundaries in our lives are very difficult. They're just so porous. And I think about the fact that like young kids, what do they just play, like they're happy to like drop in place and just like play or whatever. Like they see another little kid and they're like, you want to play tag? I mean, I think you're totally right. Like it's not an innate thing. It's something that we're trained to do. And the idea of I'm never doing enough is certainly a drive of like, what does it mean to be productive? We might be saying enough because there's all these world atrocities that are happening, certainly how I often feel, but it also comes from this sense of like, I have to be productive, whether that's productive on behalf of something else or whether that's not productive on behalf of me. And I think about, I wish I remembered which friend this was. Some people talk about like the creative bucket, but this friend talked about the creative compost bucket, which I really love because that's a lot more, I think, how creatives work. This like you have to be replenishing all sorts of stuff so that you get the black gold at the end, the thing that really plants can nourish from, the really like, your creativity can spring from. And some of that might be some kinds of work, right? Some kinds of work can be really restorative. Sometimes it's, are you reading? Are you watching something? Are you listening to music? And sometimes it's, did you get in 10 minutes of sunshine a day? Because maybe just the 10 minutes of sunshine was enough. We're not naturally primed to be always on. And it's really hard for a lot of us, I think.
It is. And I think to your point about boundaries, I think really at this heightened state where we're in this machine where corporations are essentially forming our daily lives. Mm-hmm. And we have to purposefully set those boundaries. We purposefully have to push back and go, you know what? No, I'm not a machine. Mm-hmm. And you can't call me during these hours, or you can't have access to all my information by downloading your app, like we still have agency, but we forget that we do because we're all so busy and there's other elements of, social stress and manipulation happening too. But it is important to remember we're human beings. And I think that reading, and whether that's audiobook or reading, brings us to a type of connection with others and with the other experience. Because books are always more attractive when it's about an experience that's not your own, right? We want to see ourselves in it, but we want to experience something different. And we can't lose that tool. Like, I know that the reading rates are declining, but I think we also have to remember that you can use any statistic to prove anything, Absolutely. Right? And we see that in the information wars that are happening, especially in the last few years, where things are twisted and it's like, well, where did that information come from? And I don't think reading has gone down as much as the stats say. That's my conspiracy theory.
I hope you're right. I mean, one thing I will say is like a lot of kids nowadays are reading graphic novels, which people are kind of, just like people are quick to poo-poo audiobooks, they're very quick to be like, oh, graphic novels aren't reading. And I think we should get, whatever it gets kids excited to read, we should go all in on that. If it's graphic novels, maybe we should have more illustrations in books. I would love
Right.
more illustrations in books. I think that would be great. And I think a lot of authors would enjoy that too. We have to reach people where they're at. Things
Yeah.
change so quickly. The fact that like social media is now such an ingrained part of life, or like cell phones are. It wasn't that long ago that they weren't. When I was in high school, the Blackberries had just come out. Like when I was in high school when Facebook was still the you have to have an invite situation. Like, and that was like, I guess this was post MySpace. Things change quickly, and yet we can also think about, we have memories beyond that, right? And so the younger generations might not, but that doesn't mean that we can't encourage them to like take breaks from the screen, or like the reading. I think something that's so tricky with reading is that it really forces you to slow down. It's something that I joked that I dissociate with my audiobooks, but it's not a total joke, because I have had such a difficulty time physically reading in the past 4 years because it forces you to sit down and to just do that. And I've been trying really hard to at least like do a little at nighttime or something, because it's so valuable to force yourself to slow down like that. And that is really, really valuable. Again, aspirational. I'm trying to do a lot more physical reading again.
No, me too. So thinking about middle grade and adults, because all of our attention spans have been affected by the world that we live in. You mentioned your newsletter. What do you find are the best ways that you're connecting with your audience? Because obviously the newsletter might be a little bit, that's more your adult audience perhaps, or maybe, I don't know, you're writing to parents, because as we know, children aren't always buying the books themselves either. Right. Although middle grade, I'm assuming you're getting more. What are the things that you've seen that have been effective in terms of reaching them?
Well, this is still actually kind of a work in progress in figuring that out, because the book's been out for a month today, actually. Yeah. So it's been tricky because I've had this exact conversation with my marketing team and with friends of like, in adults, you're speaking to the reader, you're speaking to the buyer and the reader. For middle grade, you're speaking to the buyer who is not the reader. The educators, the librarians, the parents, and of course they might read the book too, right? But it's not for them. We're trying to convince those people to buy it for the kids in their lives, or one word of mouth thing is like kids tell each other, "Hey, read this book," sort of thing when they like it. But the biggest buyers in middle grade are schools. Those are where middle grade authors really really try to connect. So that's what I'm trying to figure that out now. Of like, how do I actually reach the people I wrote this book for, which is kids. It's nice that if an adult picks it up and enjoys it, but it's like, it's not for you, man. So school visits are the things that my team certainly stress, and that kind of middle grade authors I've spoken to are like, yeah, school visits are where it's at. That's like a whole other ball game I have to learn, of like making connections with educators and librarians and pitching myself to them, just like, I'm local, I'm around, don't you want me to come talk to your kids about something? And then, building connections that way, getting the kids coming to a classroom and then getting the books to their hands that way. I am teaming up actually tomorrow with a local bookstore to do like a little summer reading shindig with local authors. They wanted to feature me, and I was like, let's also expand it to local authors. That's like a great idea. Actually, I don't know who came up with that. I don't want to take credit for it if that wasn't me. And so, these other like local kidlit authors are coming to also do this event and do some story times. I'm going to do some guided drawings and reaching out like through the library, like how do I try to do some library events? I think you have to go where the kids are at. And I'm hoping that doing this will help. Once the paperback comes out next year, there will also be a little bit of a different thing, because apparently the paperback is also where it's at, which kind of begs the question of why do we even bother with a hardcover first for kids to begin with if the paperback is really where it's at. But it is nice to have a hardcover book, so I can't complain too much.
There's a lot of funny decision making on hardcover versus paperback happening in the last few years since COVID, I've noticed. So it feels like it's all over the board. Books that you think would have them don't. Books that it's interesting. But it is nice when you do have a hardcover release, because then you're going to have, usually a paperback release as well. Yeah. And you have another touch point. So, and I think that's a really good reminder too. Whenever you're doing book marketing, whoever your audience is, you always have to go to where they are.
Yeah.
And obviously it's different with kids. You have all these other factors that you talked about. But I think that's always the place that is the rubbing point for a lot of authors. Are like, where are they? And I think you mentioning talking to other authors, talking to, your publisher, but also just getting in the community with other authors. I wonder how much has community played a role in your career?
I don't think I'd be anywhere without community. Back in the day, there was writer Twitter, and that was great because there was a lot of writers lifting each other up, and writers who were kind of young in their careers or who were querying. There was a lot of that, and so it began for me, I think, with this writer community. Actually, you know what? Yeah, it began a little earlier than that with the binders on Facebook. That's how we met. There's this Facebook group of women and eventually kind of expanded to non-binary authors, and that community really, as you know, it's one reason why I took the plunge to leave science, was because I was suddenly publishing personal essays, and I had this writing community that was supportive about that. That was like, pitch this place, pitch that place, pitch, whatever, and like, here's pitching help. And so when I decided to take the plunge and leave science, I didn't feel as unmoored as I could have. It was still tough, like, it was not like an easy transition, but just by the nature of even having an online community was huge. And then the in-person community has really changed the game for me too. I'm unlucky enough to live in a small city where there isn't a big writing community. I'm lucky enough to be part of the small writing community that we're here, and I'm helping build it. Every week I go to my local indie bookstore and I host a write-in. My friend and I, after the MFA, we started this writing group. Every month we do a craft class, and then every week I go and I say, hey, come write with me for 2 hours. And just that, being out there in the community like that, has people coming to the bookstore, which is one way that I'm giving back to this bookstore hosting us, and coming and sitting and writing with me. And sometimes we just say hello and we don't talk about anything. And then other times they ask for my advice, and I'm able to give young writers kind of craft advice or publishing advice. And if not, does that lead to tangible, like, more sales? Not necessarily, but that's not why I do it. Right. I think it's, when I had my launch event for the Bruising of Kilwa, I was like, I don't know if anyone's going to show up. But when I had the launch event for the Glade, I was like, this is going to be a party for all my friends. Like, all these people who I've made this connection with, if nothing else, are going to come and celebrate this accomplishment with me and eat some cupcakes. And it was great. We had a great turnout, and it was a lot of fun. And for me, it's you can't go into it with this motive of, if I build this community, then my book will sell. That's not the point, right? It's like, if I build this community, then I have support and can support and uplift in return. And sometimes that'll lead to sales, and that's great. But again, that's kind of not the point. You can't go into it with the idea of this is a marketing thing. You have to go into it with how do I build relationships with the people around me? We don't live in or at least, like, I didn't grow up. Despite growing up in a city with lots of neighbors, I didn't grow up with parents who were like, I don't want to say not neighborly, because they were nice, but like, they didn't go and like knock on doors and like ask how people were. That's not what they did, right? Like, our next door neighbor was our local neighborhood gossip, and that's how we learned everything from her, and I love her. But I'm trying now, like, literally to get to know my next door neighbor, right? Or like across the street neighbor. I feel like we don't really live much in a culture that kind of encourages that. Or maybe it's a city problem, where we don't live in a thing that kind of encourages like our neighborliness. And of course, sometimes it's issues of safety, right? Like, sometimes it's the fact that there's a lot of Trump flags in my neighborhood, and that does not make me feel safe. But I can still have kind of community relationships. And so then I go into the writers community and know I have at least like a politically like-minded relationships there.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible to get through it without community. Sometimes online community was huge during COVID. Online community has been a big part of my life from childhood, because I was in a lot of online fandom spaces. And there's also something really meaningful about having an in-person community. The fact that every week I go to this bookstore and I'm writing there, and I have a relationship with the bookstore owners, and I have a relationship with the people who come there, and I ask about people's projects. I mean, people feel seen, and there's something really nice to being able to be able to see another person like that.
Yeah.
It feels nice for you.
Yeah, totally. So I've seen writers, especially through COVID, forgetting about bookstores and libraries. And I get that there's been the kind of a message that like, that's not where it's going to move the numbers on book sales.
Yeah.
And I know we need to think about book sales, but we also need to think about the long term and what kind of relationships we're building, and showing up at your bookstores, your local bookstore knows you. They're a lot more likely to champion you. But like you said, you're not just in it for you. People can tell immediately if you're just in it for you.
Yeah.
You know, you have to be genuine. But if you're looking to build a career and you don't care about other people, then like bugger off somewhere else because we're not for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think for some people, they are thinking about, like, some people have one book that they want to publish. And I applaud them, right? I strongly believe that anybody can learn to write a book. It's work. I think that's the thing a lot of people don't appreciate. It's not easy to write a book, but anybody can do it if you sit down and you do the work. And you learn craft, or whatever craft means in your genre or your area of choice. But if you are trying to be a writer, an author in the long run where you're putting out a lot of stuff, I mean, what are you putting it out for if not other people? You know, like, I was a desperately lonely child, and so I wrote stories to feel less alone, and I wanted people to read it to feel less alone. That was why I started writing when I was a kid. And it still holds to be the case. Like, I write stories because I want people to read them, but if I'm not with people, how am I going to be able to write stories they're going to want to read? Or how am I going to be able to write stories about them? And your local, man, I gotta tell you, like, it is, well, for one thing, I think people needs to be showing up for libraries right now. Libraries are under attack everywhere in this country. Doesn't matter where you live, they're under attack. Go to your library board of trustees meetings, befriend your librarians. But also indie bookstores, I mean, like, cultivate those relationships. Because if nothing else, you've like met some cool people who also like books, and you can talk about reading stuff. If nothing else, you can talk about the books you're reading. But, you know, like, when I did my launch event for the Glade at my bookstore, they were like, yeah, you know, Naseem's our favorite local author and Kilwa is our best-selling book. And I'm, you know, like, I'm friends with the owners. Like, I helped them move when they were moving down the street. I showed up with my truck and I helped them move. And, you know, and part of why I do my workshop stuff with them is because I want people to come to the shop. They're a great shop. But I was really touched because I was like, yeah, you know, if I make any royalties, it's because you guys are keep selling Kilwa. But just, you know, like, that is such a bonus, right? Like, I would be showing up to that shop every week, even if they didn't stock Kilwa anymore. Just by the nature of, like, we have now built a relationship, you know, where we can rely on each other.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, yeah, it's a whole ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
Amazon taking over and killing most of these bookstores. It's not just Amazon. It's also us choosing Amazon over our bookstores. And I'm not saying that to guilt people, but if you are an author who wants to make a living at your career, I think it's important to recognize your partners in that. And your partner isn't just your publisher or your writer friends. It's also bookstores and libraries and anyone involved in that. Like, how are you showing up as a good literary citizen?
Yeah.
And we're in it together that way. And the more we are in it together, the more change we can see. It does grow, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we are seeing a resurgence of independent bookstores.
Yes.
You know?
It's been very exciting to see how many people are just like, well, fine, I'll start a little book cart, or like, I'll start this little bookstore, particularly in small communities where there might not be a lot. You know, Reno, despite being a city, we have one Barnes & Noble, we have one used bookstore, and we have 2 independent bookstores. And the independent bookstore we had here for 40 years closed last year. You know, so it's still like a very small literary community, but, you know, especially if you're in a small community, show up, because that makes all the difference, having that one more person, that one more voice. It is impactful for you, it's impactful for them. And, you know, if something doesn't exist, you can start it. You know, like I mentioned, like, my friend and I started a workshop after the MFA because we were dissatisfied with the way that craft is taught and not taught, really. And we wanted more people to have accessibility for that. And this was before, let me think. No, this was after we sold Kilwa, actually. We would have done it even if I hadn't sold Kilwa yet, though. You know, like, the just by the nature of just like, well, we have some knowledge, let's share it. And even if you're just like, gosh, well, okay, I've never done an MFA, or I don't have a book out, well, you can show up at a coffee shop or at a bookstore and write, and invite people to write with you. You know, you don't have, you can do a, like, hey, I want to write, and I'm going to read this craft book. Does anyone want to join me in reading this craft book? And we can discuss it and do your own kind of little book club. It doesn't have to be super formalized, but it might become formalized.
Yeah.
It is, especially if you're in small literary communities, you make that much more of an impact being there and really showing up.
Yeah. How has, you know, all of these elements of who you are as an author and your author brand, you know, you have this neuroscience background, you have now middle grade and adult, you have this, what is it called? Heretics Writing
Yeah, our
Club?
Heretics Workshop. Yeah,
I
that's what
love
we
it.
call ourselves.
Advocating for libraries. How do you bring all of that together under your brand? Because that's like one of the things that everybody always asks me is, what if I'm writing in different genres, or what, you know, I have different things,
Yeah,
because we've been taught that you need to be like Stephen King or Ellen Hildebrand.
yeah.
Like you need to stay in this lane and that's it and that's your brand. So tell people a little bit about how that works for you.
Yeah, that's such a good question because that's something I was thinking a lot about. When the second book I sold was a middle grade horror as opposed to a secondary world adult fantasy novella, and the unifying thread in whatever you're writing or working on is you. You know, like, and people contain multitudes. I contain multitudes. You contain multitudes, and this, I think it's a very capitalist idea of like, how do we just define you in a narrow box? People aren't put in boxes. You can't put people in boxes, right? There's always that one thing that's going to stick out because you can't close the lid. I'm going to lose the metaphor again, so I'll stop with that. But
That was pretty good though.
the thing that I was thinking about this as I was kind of like, okay, how do I update just on a practical level? How do I update my website to like still have all these things? When I talk informally, I say stuff like very queer, very brown books because that's really the basis, right? But I have been trying to refine the messaging, so that's kind of I think still a work in progress of like centering marginalized characters and experiences. By adding the characters, we were talking a little bit about the writing, the fiction. By adding the experiences, I feel like that also encompasses stuff like the library work and stuff like my teaching. Because I teach craft classes that are not entirely, but overwhelmingly focused on kind of, I'm a racialized writer, and so how do I use that to create kind of more interesting, dynamic, more revolutionary storytelling, right? I also have a revision workshop, and so the way that I think about that is like, well, I have scientist training, so I'm going to teach you how to approach revision like a scientist. I think about like, if I'm the unifying thread in this, there's going to be bits of me no matter what the story is, right? Like on the surface level, you could look at the Glade and you could look at Kilwa and be like, all right, let me just think about the surface similarities. There's influence of like Persian and Iranian culture. There's queer characters. There's brown characters. If nothing else, there are those things, right? And so if I think about myself as like, what are the things I'm consistently bringing to every project I do? Every project I do is going to be very queer and very brown. That's kind of like my shorthand go-to. And I don't try to pretend like they're not also different things. I'm not going to tell you that people who read Kilwa are going to necessarily like the Glade because the Glade is for kids, right? I fully embrace the fact that like there's this kind of this idea of, well, how do I write an original thing? It's like, well, first of all, get rid of the idea that you have to write an original thing because people don't want originality, right? Originality is really, really hard to sell. But the bigger thing is, what is originality? It means you're adding your own perspective to a thing. That's the truth of originality. It's not that you're coming up with something that no one has ever seen. You're not going to do that. Yeah. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak if you think you're going to do that. Rather, think about what is it that you and your lived experiences bring to a thing. My lived experience is always going to bring queerness, transness, and brownness to a thing. No matter, even if it's a made-up world. Kilwa is a secondary world. I built that word from scratch, and it has my sensibilities threaded throughout. The Glade is set in the modern Midwest, and I still bring my sensibilities throughout.
Yeah.
There's no way that people will pick up a book and not know it's mine if they're familiar with my stuff. But don't limit yourself. Don't say, like, well, I've written a young adult novel, and so I can only write young adult novels. Why? You know? Yeah. Some authors will tell you things like, oh, you know, like, I think V.E. Schwab is a good example of this. V.E. Schwab writes under V.E. Schwab for her adult stuff and under Victoria Schwab for her young adult stuff. Some people will have, like, practical advice like that. I decided to stick with my name because having an Iranian name on a book, for me, was more important. That someone could be like, wait a minute, this is like Naseem, like that's a name that I'm culturally familiar with. That was to me was more important than trying to make a little bit more distinction between my adult and kidlit. Man, like don't feel bound. And also, if you want to write the same thing 5 times, I think that we're all constantly doing that as writers. You know, we are working through our things, however it may be, and sometimes I think you should lean into that. You know, if you realize that several of your projects actually are kind of working on the same issue, man, that is saying something about you. You know, like something that you can lean into. You can embrace that. Sometimes we're not ready to embrace it. I mean, take care of yourselves, do therapy. Therapy is good, but
it's true. Yeah. do your therapy and do your writing. We are human beings who are always working on certain things, and we're born with certain personalities and obsessions. And that's why it's great when we show up as exactly who we are instead of something that we're trying to craft that we think we should be. So circling back to early on, you took that course from me like before, I don't think you were even pitching yet.
I don't think so.
Yeah. How has that shaped your career moving forward, having that knowledge about author brand? Because a lot of people think, oh, I don't need to think about this till I get a book deal, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely, at the beginning, was kind of like, oh, do I even need a website if I don't have an agent? Yes. Have a landing page, you know? I think the thing to remember is that it's not going to stay stagnant. There's certain things about you that are going to stay the same. Like I said, I write very clear, very brown books, right? But how I decide to present that is probably going to change with every book. Don't have to do it by book. That's an example. But it's about being strategic, right? This is something I also have been trying to do with in terms of just approaching my projects, right? Like, don't write to the market. That's never going to work because the books sell 2 years in advance. And so things you're reading now sold 2 years ago. And so if you try to sell things, the times will have changed. The market will have shifted. But if you keep an eye to the market of like, oh, a lot of these kinds of books are selling, let me think about what projects I have that do or don't fit into that, right? But I think author branding is something very similar, you know, like what is it that when the first person comes across your work, what are they going to come away with? And that doesn't mean like write the personal essay toward that. For example, like that's where I got I think we both got our start kind of in the personal essay creative nonfiction realm.
Yeah.
It's an awareness thing, you know, like the things that I was writing my early personal essays on were about gender. How funny now that I have a lot of queer and a lot of trans characters. Like that is a consistent through line with my work, right?
Right.
Even though I was writing about kind of my own gender exploration and the fact that I was very new to understanding my transness at the time, that has a direct lineage in the fact that I write trans characters now, very unapologetically. So I think it's a lot less about, oh no, what is the box I'm putting myself into, and much more about what is the surface I'm presenting today or for the next whatever. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, like publishing is unpredictable, whether it's article publishing, essay publishing, whether it's book publishing. So you might find like, oh, you know, I actually sold an essay I didn't think I was going to sell, and now I have to kind of reevaluate things. It's still you. You are still a part of whatever that is. There's still a way. Even if it feels very different from the other stuff you're working on, there's still a way to talk about that. So I really think it comes down to strategy and not feeling like you're not locking anything. You're not saving the PDF and now you can't edit the PDF because who has like Adobe or whatever. It's very much a like, let me try this. Let me try that. Yeah. Let me try this. And especially because most of us have, in fact, the luxury of not being very famous. We can try a lot of things. You can switch stuff up and see what feels right. So that's the other thing is that, you know, if you try something like, I don't know if this is for me, don't. You know, right. Talk about yourself in a different way, pitch yourself a different way, or do your logo something different if it feels really, I mean, it's not immutable. In fact, we should embrace the fact that it's constantly changing.
Yeah. I think that's one of the big misunderstandings is that you're going to package yourself in a certain way and then you're stuck with that. And that's not at all what branding actually is. It's really personal branding anyway, you know?
Yeah.
It's giving yourself that foundation where you're like, I know these things, kind of like you were saying before, I know these things about myself that aren't going to change.
Yeah.
My strengths, my beliefs, well, maybe your beliefs might change here and there, but you know, certain values, whatever. And then being able to have that freedom to show up in whatever different ways and experiment, knowing you kind of always have that home base in yourself to come back to.
I love that. And I don't think it's ever too early to do that. You know, on a practical level, if you want to publish stuff, have some sort of landing page, whether that's a social media page or, you know, like Linktree is a really good option, or a card is another good option. Like you don't have to shell out a ton of money to have like a landing page, but
totally.
You know, what happens once that first thing sells? Because if you keep at it, right, this industry is one full of rejection and it's also got those acceptances, right? You just have to keep at it, and it's exhausting and it can be disheartening. Like I'm not denying or trying to downplay any of that. It's absolutely true. But if you believe that this is the path for you, you keep at it because you're like, have to do this. And so eventually those acceptances will come in. Eventually you'll have those things. And so if you already have some sort of scaffolding for yourself, it is so much easier then to insert the things into that scaffolding. And okay, this other thing changes. I guess I have to add a roof here or something. I really need to stop with these metaphors because they go wild.
I'm all for weird metaphors. No, it's true though, because if you wait until you get a book deal or whatever, you are going to be so much more influenced by what other people are telling you need to do.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to have your compass to go back to if you didn't already discover what your compass is. And there's a lot of pressure. I see first-time authors, especially with big 5 deals, where they're just like, well, they know everything and I just need to listen. And it's like, no. Like you still have a say in so much. But if you don't know what you think yet, it's hard to have a say. And then you're scrambling to get it in that last minute. And like you said, you literally just a landing page. Like I tell people, just have a good bio and a picture of yourself even, and some clips, maybe if you have them, even if you don't have them, because the other misconception is authors are always thinking, which makes sense, people are going to encounter me through my writing first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
It's not necessarily true.
They're going to maybe hear you on a podcast first, or see a social post, or see you at the bookstore or whatever. And so you have to think about that side of things. Not, the work is obviously ultimately important, but that's a different skill set and a different avenue.
Absolutely. There's lots of people in my life that I'm like, I don't think you've ever read any of my stuff, and that's fine. People I've met out in community because I've gone into community. Before I had a lot of things published, I would do podcasts because I love talking. And so I would, I do that kind of stuff. I think assuming that someone has not read your work is actually going to benefit you in the long run, because then you don't assume that once your book has come out, people have heard of you, which I think can be a road to heartbreak. The fact that that Kilwa came from a small press and that I had events where literally zero people showed actually was huge for me, because it helped me reset expectations. The fact that I've struggled so much on submission has been so good for me, because it reminds me that, it's devastating, but it's humbling in a good way. It's humbling in the way of I am one of so many people doing this thing, and the success stories, the big ones that we hear about, those are the exceptions. Most of us are chugging along, and then 10 years later, someone's like, breakout sensation. You're like, I've been here for 10 years, but okay.
Yeah.
But it is, I can't believe that I left science 8 years ago. It's been 8 years already. It's been 8 years, and I look back, I really kind of marvel at where my career is now, because I don't think I could have imagined that 8 years ago. I think even for every moment that I'm so disheartened by my career now, I think about the fact that 8 years ago, I left a career that I thought was a surefire. I left an incredibly prestigious PhD program that was sure to set me up for the rest of my scientific career. And I said, I'm going to write. And how I had no idea. And the first 10 months of that, I was incredibly depressed and barely did any writing. So I think about, wow, okay, but it happened. We haven't sold all these books I have on submission, and yet we sold 2 of them. I have 2 books out, and I think the 9-year-old who started writing would be in utter awe of that.
Yeah.
At some point, you will be living the dream that your past could only have dreamt about, and you have to allow yourself to grow from a place. I started my newsletter. I started my newsletter doing rants about politics, things that I really had no business talking about because I did not have enough knowledge. And it's not a huge newsletter, but people are still following me. And so when I was like, oh, I finally sold a book, I could because I'd been just doing this newsletter for people who knew me, I could build upon that. People took a chance on just being supportive from that get-go. Not everyone's going to be able to support you financially, but a lot of people are willing to sign up for a newsletter, or a lot of people are willing to read a thing that you put out, even if it's on your blog. And it is not a bad thing to be humbled in that way, because at some point it's going to be wow, but there's a version of me that's in awe now.
Good.
That's
yeah.
a nice feeling.
I think we always think, to our earlier point, we can always do more, it can always be better, but it is important to acknowledge the successes. And when you were saying that, I was thinking about that idea that our ancestors fought to even get us to this point. They would be so proud.
Yeah. Not
just ourselves, but the people who came before us and fought for everything that they did to get our generation to where we are is I don't know. It helps me remember I'm not alone. Like,
Yeah.
we're all a part of this human continuum, and what we're putting out there is important. And you never know. I mean, like Elizabeth Gilbert, I think she had like 3 books out before Eat, Pray, Love came out
Mm-hmm.
and
Something
blew
like
out.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And those books all still sell on the backlist because of, that success with that one. And not to say everybody's going to have an Eat, Pray, Love situation, but it all adds up. It all matters. All these little pieces we think aren't that big of a deal do add up. And like you were saying, having something in place before that book comes out, you weren't starting from zero then.
Yeah.
When the book came
It
out,
kind of felt like I did, and then I was just like, oh, but I'm not. And then I reached out to you and I was like, please help. but it if nothing else, it's just like, okay, I'm not starting from total zero. At some point you have to start from total zero. So if you do that a little earlier, you'll thank yourself for it later.
Right, totally. Okay, so I know we got to run. One last question for people who are BIPOC authors, writers, creators, painters, whatever their art is,
Yeah.
or queer, non-binary, any kind of marginalized specifically, because we know it's harder. What advice do you have for them?
I don't want to pretend like things aren't harder, because they are. The more different intersections of marginalizations you have, and the more that comes through in your work, which I would argue for your work to be the truest of itself, it will have to, the harder it will be to make inroads in mainstream industry. That being said, ask yourself if you would be fulfilled if you stopped. It is... I mean, I really try to remember this every time I'm like, well, we still haven't sold this book. So I'm really coming from a place of, man, I know the struggle. But I would not be happy if I wasn't telling stories and if I wasn't telling them the ways that I felt to be truest to me. And I would argue that most people who try this kind of thing also fall into that boat. And that does not mean that you shouldn't write the things that are truest to you. I think there are ways to be strategic, right? I mentioned that, like taking a look at the market, thinking about what projects you want to work on, maybe shuffling things around. I do think it means that we should be aware of these uphill battles, but I firmly believe that the multiplicity of stories is how we change the world. In addition to doing the literal work, right? We have to do the literal work of showing up. But art is slow cultural change. That still has to, the art still has to happen in order for that slow culture change to happen. And it is only when we tap into our marginalized experiences that we can help shift the cultural thing. And particularly if you come from cultures that don't have great representation in the US, and I don't just mean that as like physical, like, oh, I'm writing an Iranian representation. I also mean things like, how am I incorporating like Iranian storytelling methods into my work? It is harder. Again, like I want to stress this because I think there is this misconception of like, well, you write diverse things and therefore you sell. That's absolutely not the case. And yet, when you finally get that thing, whether it's something that you've published yourself, whether it's something that someone else has published, all it takes is one other person saying thank you for you to realize, oh, this was worth it. This was worth it. So keep working on the stuff. Have a backlog. Backlogs are great. They definitely help because then you can have multiple things kind of going out. And it will be discouraging, and that does not mean you should stop.
Yeah.
That's all the more reason to keep going. Because one day, one other person will pick up your work and go, I didn't know it could be like this. And truly just that one other person makes a difference.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's so important to see examples of other people that are similar to us that have done it.
Yeah. Yeah. It has been, I've had a few kind of Iranian people reach out to me and be like, oh, wow, like, thank you. And I'm like, oh, thank you. The fact that there were a few Iranian authors meant that I could be like, oh, this is doable for me. And so particularly if there aren't a lot of people in your community who have made any sort of inroads, it's all the more reason that you should try you someone else wants to too, and they don't realize that they can until they see you and your work.
Yeah. And I am white and don't have the same lived experience as you, but I know working with clients in all types of different marginalized situations and being a woman.
And you were a young mom and a young single mom. I think, like that's an experience that I think a lot of people,
Yeah, the class stuff and the single mom stuff was definitely, I have, I guess, a window into some of those marginalized experiences. But I want to say too, and I wonder if you agree with this, that like I feel like the more you educate yourself on how the system works, whatever system that is, in this case, publishing, that's how you understand how to circumvent and work with it, like work with it or against it or around it. But you got to educate yourself on how it works. I find that so much of the misinformation is what creates the fear.
Yeah.
So like the more you can learn and find the people who are allies to teach you, which by the way, I just want to plug that you teach.
I teach. I have some courses coming up. Yeah, I agree with that. Every time I talk to my agent, I have like 20,000 stuff about the industry. I want to hear as much stuff because particularly publishing is incredibly opaque. There's a lot of bad information out there. And if you know that, then you can figure out what's the right path for you, right? Like you might learn about traditional publishing and go, okay, well, I want an agent, but I don't want to work with the big five. I actually want to work with these small independent publishers. Or you might be like, wow, my work is doing the stuff that it'll be hard for an agent to do. I'm going to go the self-publishing route. I'm going to figure out how to make that work. And then you can figure out, how do you make self-publishing work, right? Like I really admire self-published authors because the kind of level of work that you have to do in order to make inroads. Also, we've seen the ways that the big five has been like, oh, that self-published author was successful, let's buy their books. So it's like there's value there. And there's so many people who we would never otherwise get to share their stories and who are able to share their stories that way. So, I think education about the industry you're going into and the systems that inform it are vital. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to add before we go? I really appreciate all of this.
I think that's my final words of wisdom, but just
I think that's good.
Keep going. It's a tough road out there, but that's why we need each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Really quick, can you tell people where to find you?
Yes, there's that. So the best way to follow my work is to subscribe to my newsletter, which you can find at naseemwrites.com or at naseemwrites.kit.com for a more direct sign up. It comes out every other week. One is a personal essay and one is a newsletter, and you can choose to opt into both or just the writing stuff. I am on Instagram at jamsternazi. That's also my Blue Sky handle. It's like jamsternazi.bluesky.social or whatever that is. But my newsletter is the place I pour a lot of my kind of those efforts. I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but if this does come out before that, and if you are a racialized writer, I am teaching a course through the Carl Brandon Society called Cultural Storytelling, where I talk about how dipping into storytelling methods from other parts of the world and other traditions fulfills N.K. Jemison's imperative to write revolutionary speculative fiction. I'm developing that as a Writing the Other course as well, so I'm hopefully going to do that this fall. But if you're not a racialized writer, in November, I will be doing a revision workshop with Clarion West. And that's not just for speculative fiction, that's in general. And it's part, how do you read for craft, which I do through the scientific method. I call it reading like a scientist. And part, then how do you plan your revisions scientifically? Because I believe in it, it makes a difference. What's the final thing I'm teaching? And I'm teaching through Tin House this year, which I'm really psyched about. They asked me to be part of the faculty of their online speculative fiction in the fall programs. Yeah.
Awesome. And we'll make sure that all the links are included in text, so you don't have to try to figure out how to spell things or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I
really appreciate exploring all these things with me. I know it'll help a lot of people.
I hope so.